Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to the very final part of my read-along discussions of Charles Dickens's Bleak House. So over the last 18 months I have been hosting a read-along of Charles Dickens's novel Bleak House. We have read it in the original serialised monthly parts from March last year, I think, through to September of this year. It's been a long process. Dickens often rounded off his serialised novels with a double bill. So I have 8 chapters to talk to you about today, so this is going to be quite a long video. I think we're probably looking at an hour. So the 8 chapters that we read in the month of September, the final 8 chapters of Bleak House, are Chapter 60, Perspective, Chapter 61, A Discovery, Chapter 62, Another Discovery, Chapter 63, Steel and Iron, Chapter 64, Esther's Narrative, Chapter 65, Beginning the World, Chapter 66, Down in Lincolnshire, and Chapter 67, The Close of Esther's Narrative. Some of these chapters are quite short. I'm going to try and go through them relatively briefly because otherwise we will be here a really long time, but still, many exciting chapters, all of the exciting stuff that closes Bleak House, lots of drama here and lots of things to discuss. So, Chapter 60, Perspective. In this chapter we see Esther kind of recovering from the grief of her mother's death. She's still living with Mr. Jarndyce and Mrs. Woodcourt. Mr. Woodcourt's mother has come to stay with them for a while. Esther continues to be really worried about Ada and Richard. Richard is looking more ill by the day, and Ada is growing continually worried by his state of health, especially because Ada has just found out that she is pregnant and she's really worried that Richard is not going to live to see his child. We also find out that Miss Flight too is a bit worried about Richard, though she certainly seems to think if they're expecting him to live a long time, as she has decided to appoint him as executor in her will, because they two are the people who go to Chancery most often, which is quite depressing. Miss Flight has also acquired 2 new birds, which she has named the wards in Chancery, which is not a good omen really for our 2 wards of Chancery. So, a few points of interest in this chapter. One is that this chapter begins with Esther sort of telling a little bit about how nice everyone was to her while she was grieving for her mother, and that she has been ill after finding out about her mother's death. She picks up her narrative from the point at which she is more recovered, because Esther, as usual, doesn't want to talk about her misery, doesn't want to talk about her sorrow, tries to avoid talking about herself. I just want to talk quickly about the relationship between Esther and Mr. Jarndyce in this chapter. It's worth noting that Esther is a little bit, not exactly concerned, but a little bit surprised that although Ada has left and married Richard, still nothing has been said about when she is going to marry Mr. Jarndyce, as she said she would. And considering what we learn later on in the rest of the book, in the very end of the book, it's very significant, I think, when Esther talks to Mr. Jarndyce about the fact that they're staying in London and not a Bleak House, and Mr. Jarndyce says, "Bleak House must learn to take care of itself." I thought his tone sounded sorrowful, but looking at him I saw his kind face lighted by its pleasantest smile. Bleak House, he repeated, and his tone did not sound sorrowful, I found, must learn to take care of itself. I think that's important because whenever Esther talks previously about her upcoming marriage to Mr. Jarndyce, she always uses the term Bleak House to talk about her engagement. And Bleak House kind of therefore stands in as a metaphor for Mr. Jarndyce. So I think when Mr. Jarndyce says that, that's kind of him having made up his mind now that he is going to break off his engagement with her. We said no more about it, nor did he say a word about the future of Bleak House, referring to their upcoming marriage. But it was the first time I had taken my seat at his side in my mourning dress, and that accounted for it, I considered. We know too that Esther feels slightly uncomfortable about having Mrs. Woodcourt in the house. She likes her a lot more now than she used to, but she feels uncomfortable about her presence because she reminds her of Mr. Woodcourt. I want to talk a bit about Ada in this chapter, because I think she is a really interesting character. We see her kind of self-sacrificing nature in the way that she loves Richard and cares for him, and the way that she loves him and kind of makes the best of their marriage that she possibly can. That the money Ada brought him was melting away with the candles I used to see burning after dark in Mr. Vholes's office I knew very well. It was not a large amount in the beginning. He had married in debt, and I could not fail to understand by this time what was meant by Mr. Vholes's shoulder being at the wheel, as I still heard it was. My dear made the best of housekeepers and tried hard to save, but I knew that they were getting poorer and poorer every day. She shone in the miserable corner like a beautiful star. She adorned and graced it so that it became another place, paler than she had been at home, and a little quieter than I had thought natural when she was yet so cheerful and hopeful. Her face was so unshadowed that I half believed she was blinded by her love of Richard to his ruinous career. I think it's really interesting to note the way Ada is described. Ada in many ways is a very typical early Dickensian heroine. They are mainly characterised by their beauty and their sweetness. They are self-sacrificing and loving and caring and not all that much else. And I do think there is a lot more to Ada. I do think she is a fairly fully fledged and well-rounded character, and I do think her relationship with Esther and her relationship with Richard is very believable. But I think it's important to note that while Ada is still described and kind of idealised in the terms of the early Dickensian heroine and in a much more sort of conventional portrait of the ideal Victorian woman, she is the angel in the house here. She is the person that makes the room she shares with Richard better. She is described as being a star. But I think it's also important to remember that Ada is not our heroine. Esther is our heroine, and Esther is not like Ada. Esther is not beautiful. Esther is not all sweetness. Esther is clever and driven by her desire to work. Esther is self-sacrificing, and yet, as we will talk about later on in these chapters, she is not sacrificed at the end. So I do think it's kind of important to dwell upon that as well, and the fact that Ada is described in very sort of typical Ada in the house terms, but I do think it's important to note that Ada is not the heroine of this book, and to see the kind of differences between Esther and her. It's worth mentioning as well a little bit about Miss Flight. I don't have too much to say here that I haven't already covered in my kind of summary. She says that Richard is, next to myself, the most constant suitor in court, which is definitely a sign for all of us to worry. And she tells Esther she has added 2 birds to her collection. I call them the wards in Jarndyce. They're caged up with all the others, with hope, joy, youth, peace, rest, life, dust, ashes, waste, want, ruin, despair, madness, death, cunning, folly, words, wigs, rags, sheepskin, plunder, precedent, jargon, gammon, and spinach. Of course, there are a lot of quite clear symbols here. One is the fact that these birds of hers, the wards in Jarndyce, are caged up, as Ada and Richard are kind of stuck in chancery, but also her birds are named in kind of phases. There are like happy things, then there are miserable things, then there's nonsense, and the wards in Jarndyce are caught up in nonsense, which is perhaps where chancery in Dickens's mind belongs. Let's talk a little more about Richard. There is a ruin of youth which is not like age, and into such a ruin Richard's youth and youthful beauty had fallen away. He ate little and seemed indifferent what it was, showed himself to be much more impatient than he used to be, and was quick even with Ada. Then later, on his return, he told us more than once that Vholes was a good fellow, a safe fellow, a man who did what he pretended to do, a very good fellow indeed. He was so defiant about it that it struck me he began to doubt Mr. Vholes. I find the ending of this chapter really powerful, and I just want to read a few passages which I think tell you quite a lot about Ada's character, both about her like self-sacrificing nature, both about the fact that she loves Richard to the extent that she feels willing to put up with a horrible life for him, to be with him, because that is all she wants. But also I think it tells you about her strength as well. When we were married, I had some little hope that I might be able to convince him of his mistake, that he might come to regard it in a new way as my husband and not pursue it all the more desperately for my sake as he does. But if I had not had that hope, I would have married him just the same, Esther, just the same. When I married Richard, I was quite determined, Esther, if heaven would help me, never to show him that I grieve for what he did, and to make him more unhappy. I look forward a little while, and I don't know what great aid may come to me. When Richard turns his eyes upon me, there may be something lying on my breast more eloquent than I have been, with greater power than mine to show him his true course and win him back. If that little creature should fail too, Esther, I still look forward. I look forward a long while through years and years, and think that then, when I am growing old, or when I am dead perhaps, a beautiful woman, his daughter, happily married, may be proud of him and a blessing to him. These hopes uphold me, my dear Esther, and I know they will, though sometimes even they depart from me before a dread that arises when I look at Richard, that he may not live to see his child. Moving on to chapter 61, A Discovery. In this chapter, Esther goes to see Mr. Skimpole to persuade Skimpole not to spend so much time with Richard and to not spend so much of Richard's money, which he does seem to succeed in doing. We, as the readers, think as badly of Skimpole as ever. He is determined as ever to make everyone believe that he is a child, and so that of course he'll stop going to see Richard, but why would he ever have thought about it before? Because he knows nothing about money. And when Esther confronts him about the £5 note bribe he received from Bucket, he of course says as usual, well, I'm a child, I know nothing about money. Then Esther goes to see Ada and Richard as usual, and on her way home she is walked home by Mr. Woodcourt, and when they get back to the house there is no one else there. Mr. Jarndyce did not go to meet Esther as he said he would. He is out with Mrs. Woodcourt, and Mr. Woodcourt and Esther are alone, and Mr. Woodcourt tells Esther that he loves her and asks her to marry him. Her first thought is too late, but she says to him that she is not free, and he leaves and they sort of part as friends. So lots of things to talk about in this chapter as always. First, let's dwell on Mr. Skimpole. Not that I really want to dwell on Mr. Skimpole because he is one of my most loathed characters in Dickens. He has done so well and he is so dreadful and awful. Not go there? Certainly not, my dear Summerson. Most assuredly not. Why should I go there? When I go anywhere, I go for pleasure. I don't go anywhere for pain because I was made for pleasure. Pain comes to me when it wants me. Now, I have had very little pleasure at our dear Richard's lately. And Esther confronts him about the bribe. He says, you know I don't pretend to be responsible. I never could do it. I am hopeless of understanding it. I can't be bribed. Not by anybody. I don't attach any value to money. I don't care about it. I don't know about it. I don't want it. I don't keep it. It goes away from me directly. How can I be bribed? And I think we have our final condemnation of Mr. Skimpole when Esther tells us the story of the rest of his life as he never saw him again. He died some years afterwards and left a diary behind him with letters and other materials towards his life, which was published and which showed him to have been a victim of a combination of the part of mankind against an amiable child. It was considered very pleasant reading, but I never read more of it myself than the sentence on which I chanced to light on opening the book. It was, Jarndyce, in common with most men I have known, is the incarnation of selfishness. And we know, from having read the rest of the book, that any person who could describe Mr. Jarndyce as the incarnation of selfishness was probably the incarnation of selfishness himself. And now we have the walk home and the proposal between Mr. Woodcourt and Esther. One thing I think it is worth noting is that Esther is supposed to meet Mr. Jarndyce and doesn't, and therefore Mr. Woodcourt walks home with her. And I think from the later chapters that the implication is that Mr. Jarndyce has purposely not met them so that Mr. Woodcourt will go home with her. He has arranged it that way. We were standing by the opened window, looking down into the street, when Mr. Woodcourt spoke to me. I learned in a moment that he loved me. I learned in a moment that my scarred face was all unchanged to him. I learned in a moment that what I had thought was pity and compassion was devoted, generous, faithful love. Oh, too late to know it now. Too late, too late. That was the first ungrateful thought I had. Too late. I feel so bad for Esther. I feel like this is a very sad scene for Esther. Because she does love him. We know she loves him. We've always known that she loves Mr. Woodcourt. Although certainly she values him and esteems him highly, that she admires him, that she's attracted to him, that she would be happy with him. And it's too late because she is engaged to marry Mr. Jarndyce. And yet she is so honoured and touched. And I think it's very important to note that Esther would never and does not consider breaking off her engagement with Mr. Jarndyce. The first thing she thinks is not, there's a chance. The first thing she thinks is, it's too late. And she regrets that it's too late, but that is still the first thing she thinks. There is nothing to be done as far as she is concerned. And I have to say, I think the love scene between Woodcourt and Esther here is quite awkward. I think it's written quite awkwardly. I think the dialogue is a bit awkward. I think the things they say feel quite stilted. And I think there is a reason why. I like to think there's a reason why. I imagine because this is Esther's narrative, and we know throughout the book how much Esther kind of hates talking about herself and hates talking about really personal things. And I think she just can't write it properly. That's always like been in my head. Dickens has done it on purpose, that it feels awkward because it's not quite exactly what was said, because Esther can't quite do it right. You know, the reason why we don't get to hear the words Mr. Woodcourt says when he first says that he loves her is because Esther can't kind of bear to write it in her unreliable narrator state. And yet there are some really powerful moments, especially in what Esther says. I am deeply sensible of your generosity, and I shall treasure its remembrance to my dying hour. I know full well how changed I am. I know that you are not unacquainted with my history, and I know what a noble love it is which is so faithful. What you have said to me could have affected me so much from no other lips, for there are none that could give it such a value to me. It shall not be lost. It shall make me better. Oh, Esther. He left me, and I stood at the dark window watching the street. His love, in all its constancy and generosity, had come so suddenly upon me that he had not left me a minute when my fortitude gave way again and the street was blotted out by my rushing tears. But they were not tears of sorrow and regret. No. He had called me the beloved of his life and had said I would evermore be as dear to him as I was then, and I felt as if my heart would not hold the triumph of having heard those words. My first wild thought had died away. It was not too late to hear them, for it was not too late to be animated by them, to be good, true, grateful and contented. How easy my path, how much easier than his. It's really good. I love Bleak House. Let's move on to the next chapter. Chapter 62, A Discovery. Towards the beginning of this chapter, Esther speaks to Mr. Jarndyce about when they're going to be married, and he says that she will become the mistress of Bleak House in about a month from now. And then shortly after that, Mr. Bucket appears, bringing with him Mr. Smallweed, and he says that Mr. Smallweed has found something in Mr. Crook's shop, and it appears to be a will with the name of Jarndyce on. Mr. Bucket brings it to Mr. Jarndyce immediately, and Mr. Jarndyce and Esther take it to Mr. Kenge, who is Mr. Jarndyce's solicitor, to see whether or not it is real. And Mr. Kenge says that it appears to be a will of a later date than any of the ones they currently have, which does seem to be correct, which seems to reduce Mr. Jarndyce's inheritance considerably, but increase Ada and Richard's quite a lot. He says that this is a very important document, that him and the rest of the lawyers on the case will look into it, and that at the next sessions it will be brought before the court. So, a very interesting chapter. Point of interest in this chapter, but we'll talk first again about Mr. Jarndyce and Esther. He had never yet altered his old manner. I loved it and him so much that I now went up to him and took my usual chair, which was always put at his side, for sometimes I read to him and sometimes I talked to him and sometimes I silently worked by him. I hardly liked to disturb it by laying my hand on his breast, but I found I did not disturb it at all. Dear guardian, I know how you have felt all that has happened and how considerate you have been. As so much time have passed, and as you spoke to me only this morning of my being so well again, perhaps you expect me to renew the subject. Perhaps I ought to do so. I will be the mistress of Bleak House when you please. And he says, when shall we give Bleak House its mistress, little woman? When you pleased. Next month? Next month, dear guardian. The day on which I take the happiest and best step of my life, the day on which I shall be a man more exalting and more enviable than any other man in the world, the day on which I give Bleak House its little mistress shall be next month then, said my guardian. I put my arms around his neck and kissed him, just as I had done on the day when I brought my answer. So, a few things to talk about here. One is the fact that Esther does love Mr. Jarndyce in her way. I think it's in quite a fatherly, platonic way, but she does love him, and I do think that's important to recognise why Esther acts as she does throughout the course of this book. But I think it's also important to hear again the way Esther still talks about her marriage. She talks about being the mistress of Bleak House. She says, I will be the mistress of Bleak House when you please, not I will be your wife when you please. Talking about being the mistress of Bleak House as though it is a kind of job position that she is taking, which in a way it kind of is. But it's important too, knowing what we know now, having read to the end of the book, that we know Mr. Jarndyce is not planning to marry her. And when he says, the day on which I take the happiest and best step of my life, what he means is releasing her, not marrying her, which I think is worth pointing out as well. Now we come on to the stuff of the will. I feel like there's not too much to say here, except that there has been a will found. Little by little, he very slowly took from his breast pocket a stained, discoloured paper, which was much singed upon the outside and a little burnt at the edges, as if it had been long ago thrown upon a fire and hastily snatched off again. And they bring it to Mr. Kenge. At first he had not seemed to attach much importance to the paper, but when he saw it he appeared more interested, and when he opened and read a little of it through his eyeglass he became amazed. Mr. Jarndyce, he said, looking off it, you have perused this? Not I, returned my guardian. But my dear sir, said Mr. Kenge, it is a will of later date than any in the suit. It appears to be all in the testator's handwriting. It is duly executed and attested. If you had perused this document, you would have seen that it reduces your interest considerably, though still leaving it a very handsome one. You would further have seen that the interests of Mr. Richard Carstone and of Miss Ada Clare, now Mrs. Richard Carstone, are very materially advantaged by it. Which sounds like good news, except that, as Mr. Jarndyce points out, Do you ask me to believe that any good is to come of Jarndyce and Jarndyce? No, of course not. We have never believed it. And now on to chapter 63, Steel and Iron. In this chapter we pick up with Mr. George, one of my favourite characters in this book, and Mr. George is going off to see his brother. He is not necessarily expecting a great reception from his brother, and we also find out in this chapter that Mr. Rouncewell has just made an agreement with his son and with Rosa that his son and Rosa will be married in a year's time. Rosa is going away to study on the continent with her future sisters-in-law, and then they will be married in a year's time. George is also very determined to get his mother to scratch him out of his will, which Mr. Rouncewell says is absolutely impossible. And Mr. George just therefore says that when his mother dies, he'll just give all his share to his brother anyway. We also learn in this chapter that Mr. George is gone back to live at Chesney Wold and is helping Celesta Dedlock, who is very ill and kind of needs someone to rely upon and someone to help him, and Mr. George is going to be that person. Mr. Rouncewell is not very impressed that George is going to live at Chesney Wold, but makes his peace with it in the end. And then Mr. George asks his brother's opinion on a letter he has written to Esther Summerson, explaining his kind of role in Captain Horden and Lady Dedlock to a certain extent, and explaining the handwriting sample he gave up to Mr. Tulkinghorn and what that all led to. Which he sends at the end of this chapter. So, points of interest in this chapter. I am not without my expectations that in the present visit I may prove to be more free than welcome. I have served as a dragoon in my day, and a comrade of mine that I was once rather partial to was, if I don't deceive myself, a brother of yours. I believe you had a brother who gave his family some trouble and ran away, and never did any good but in keeping away. Are you quite sure, returns the ironmaster in an altered voice, that your name is Steel? The trooper falters and looks at him. His brother starts up, calls him by his name, and grasps him by both hands. I like the fact that Mr. Rouncewell greets George with such joy, because we've seen Mr. Rouncewell so far, mostly in his opposition to Mr. Dedlock, be a bit proud and be a little bit dismissive, and yet we see him here in his true love of his family and how glad he is to greet Mr. George, though George has had a very different life to him. I want to also talk about the bit where Mr. Rouncewell offers George a job. You have been so brotherly as to propose to me to fall in here and take my place among the products of your preservance and sense. I thank you heartily. It is more than brotherly, as I said before, and I thank you heartily for it. But the truth is, brother, I am a kind of weed, and it's too late to plant me in a regular garden. It's not to be done. Not to be done, sir. Whereas, it falls out so, on the other hand, that I am to be of some trifle of use to Celesta Dedlock since his illness brought on by family sorrows, and that he would rather have help from a mother's son than from anybody else. Well, my dear George, returned the other, with a very slight shade upon his face, if you prefer to serve in Celesta Dedlock's household brigade. There it is, brother, cries the trooper, checking him with his hand upon his knee. There it is. You don't take kindly to that idea. I don't mind it. You are not used to being officered. I am. Everything about you is in perfect order and discipline. Everything about me requires to be kept so. We are not accustomed to carry things with the same hand or to look upon them from the same point. I don't say much about my garrison manners because I found myself pretty well at ease last night, and they wouldn't be noticed here, I dare say, once in a way. But I shall get on best at Chesney Wold, where there's more room for a weed than there is here. I really like Mr. George. I just really like him. I like the way he talks about himself. I like his kind of self-deprecating but also slightly proud about the way he's self-deprecating. I just quite enjoy it, and I like as well that he goes back to Chesney Wold to live with his mother, who he loves so much, and I think it's partly because he is happy to be of use to Celesta, who he has known a lot of his life, and to be part of this life and this place that he grew up in, but also he is happy to be there with his mother as well. I don't think there's too much to say about the letter he writes to Esther, though it is an interesting one. Here we learn that the handwriting sample he gave to Mr. Tulkinghorn was a letter from Horden asking him to deliver a letter to Lady Dedlock, or then Miss Barbary. So now we know part of the reason why Mr. Tulkinghorn was able to put it all together. Mr. George didn't realise this would do any harm because he did believe Captain Horden had been dead a very long time, had believed that he had drowned as he was officially reported to have done so, though he was not. I think as well we can probably guess from the fact that Horden was officially reported drowned that Lady Dedlock believed that he was drowned as well. And I think that's all on that one, so let's move on to chapter 64, Esther's narrative. So, this is quite an important big chapter. I feel like I'll have a lot to say on this chapter. So in this chapter, Mr. Jarndyce at the beginning gives Esther some money, which he says is for a month's time. So she begins to make kind of preparations for being married, like buying all the things that she'll need when she's married. And she doesn't tell anyone that she's going to get married very soon, thinks it'll all be done very quietly, though she does tell Mrs. Woodcourt, who says that she approves of it. And Mr. Jarndyce goes on a trip up north to the place that Mr. Woodcourt is soon to be posted to arrange something. And suddenly Esther is summoned to join him up there. She is surprised, but she goes up to join him. And he says that he has been fitting up Mr. Woodcourt's new house and that he would like her opinion on it. And Esther is so touched that Mr. Jarndyce has like prepared a house for Mr. Woodcourt, but also is like quite sad because, you know, she's very in love with Mr. Woodcourt and not going to tell anyone about that. And then together they go over the house that Mr. Jarndyce has prepared for Mr. Woodcourt, which is all done up in all of the ways that Esther likes, in a way that Esther would prepare a house, which she thinks is beautiful and really lovely, but also is a bit worried that Mr. Woodcourt will find a terrible reminder of her constantly. And then they get to the porch and they see the name written above the house, which is Bleak House. This house, like Mr. Jarndyce's, has been called Bleak House. And there Mr. Jarndyce tells her that he is breaking off their engagement because he has realised that she will be happier with Mr. Woodcourt and that she loves Mr. Woodcourt and that Mr. Woodcourt loves her, and that Mr. Woodcourt told him a while ago that he loved her. Mr. Jarndyce did not mention that they were engaged, but just kind of plotted behind their backs until the very end to set them up together, and now has created a house for Esther and Mr. Woodcourt that he is now bestowing them, and also is bestowing Esther upon Mr. Woodcourt without asking her. Lots of things I have to talk about. And then Mr. Woodcourt appears and Esther and Mr. Woodcourt are just happy and just decide that they're gonna get married. Because, you know, that's what you do when your previous fiance just decides to give you away to someone else while they're... It's a weird scene. I kind of love and hate it at once. We'll talk about it more in a minute. After that, in the second half of this chapter, Esther is delightedly happy. Her and Mr. Woodcourt are going to get married. That's all great. They go back home, and who should appear but Mr. Guppy, who pounces on Esther in front of Mr. Jarndyce and says that he still loves her, that despite the fact that her appearance has changed, he still wants to marry her. Will she marry him? And Mr. Jarndyce says no for her. And that is the end of the chapter. So, lots of things to talk about in this chapter. Yeah. I have such mixed feelings on the way Mr. Jarndyce behaves in this book. I love Mr. Jarndyce, like he is one of my favourite characters. I think he's done fantastically. I do think he's believable. I think for the most part you see him as a very nice, selfless, caring, loving person. The fact that he does not marry Esther, despite the fact that Esther has agreed to marry him, despite the fact that he knows that Esther and him would be tolerably happy, and despite the fact that he loves Esther in his way, and that Esther loves her in his, though those are different ways. I think the fact that he doesn't marry her does show that he is a selfless person. But also Mr. Jarndyce does like play puppets with people's lives in this book a bit. Especially here with Esther, he just kind of arranges everything and like sets up her marriage to someone else for her. And it would be really awkward if Esther just like turned around and was like, well actually I don't really love Mr. Woodcourt. Of course she does love Mr. Woodcourt. And the whole kind of point is that Mr. Jarndyce has a lot of emotional intelligence, perhaps as much as Esther, and he can tell that Esther is not in love with him, though she may love him, and that she is in fact in love with Mr. Woodcourt. And of course he knows that Mr. Woodcourt is in love with Esther. On the one hand, I like struggle with the fact that Mr. Jarndyce like literally gives away Esther to Mr. Woodcourt. He's literally like, oh, take my wife, here you go, which annoys me and I find frustrating. But at the same time, I think it is also worth like considering the fact that Mr. Jarndyce knows, and Dickens knows, and we as readers know, that Esther would not really allow herself to be freed, except that Mr. Jarndyce has gone this far. I feel like if Mr. Jarndyce were to sit Esther down and say, I'm not sure if you really love me, you don't have to marry me, I feel like Esther would still try and marry him, because I think that is part of Esther's personality, that she would do that. And she does have that same kind of self-sacrificing streak that Ada has, although importantly, as I said, it isn't like allowed to happen. Esther isn't allowed to like practice her self-sacrificingness. She gets her happy ending. She gets the man she's in love with, not just a man that she cares about a lot, which I think is very important, and I think that is partly why it is done like it is, and because it's, you know, a fun twist and Dickens likes a twist. But also I do find it slightly frustrating that Mr. Jarndyce just plays puppets with all of their lives, but also I love him, so I don't care. I have very mixed feelings about this. I have similar feelings about a particular character in Our Mutual Friend. Some of Dickens's male characters spend a bit too much time lying to women who they love for their own good. But at the same time, like, I feel like Mr. Jarndyce is a fully fledged character and you know why he does it. And I do think it's true that Esther wouldn't, like, give up Mr. Jarndyce and marry Mr. Woodcourt unless she really saw how seriously Mr. Jarndyce was letting her go. So yes, actually, I just stopped rambling and I'll just read you some things, because, you know, I like to read bits out of Dickens. That's basically why I make these videos. I'm getting very rambly now. All my professionalism has gone. This is the last one. We're going to go wild. Before we go on to that main scene, let's just quickly talk about the conversation Mr. Jarndyce and her have before it. Mr. Jarndyce says to her, lying, "When it was decided that Mr. Woodcourt should settle here, it came into my head that I might ask his acceptance of some unpretending and suitable little place to lay his own head in. I therefore caused such a place to be looked out for, and such a place to be found on very easy terms, and I have been touching it up for him and making it habitable. However, when I walked over it the day before yesterday, and it was reported ready, I found I was not housekeeper enough to know whether things were all as they ought to be, so I sent off for the best little housekeeper that could be got, to come and give her my advice and opinion. And here she is," said my guardian, laughing and crying both together. "Because he was so dear, so amiable, so good." That's not why you're crying and laughing together, Esther. You're crying and laughing because you're in love with Mr. Woodcourt and you know it. "When I went to bed, I cried. I am bound to confess that I cried, but I hope it was with pleasure, though I am not quite sure it was with pleasure. I repeated every word of the letter over twice." So Esther, at this point, she goes to bed and she cries, and she thinks she cries because she's happy for Mr. Woodcourt, and she's happy that Mr. Jarndyce is so kind and so kind to Mr. Woodcourt, but she's also not sure that's why she's crying. And she repeats every word of the letter Mr. Jarndyce wrote to her asking her to marry him twice in her head, to remind herself that she has done the right thing, to tell herself that she has done the right thing because she knows that she hasn't. "We entered a flower garden by a gate in the side wall of which he had the key, and the first thing I saw was the beds and flowers were all laid out according to the manner of my beds and flowers at home. I saw in the paperings on the walls, in the colours of the furniture, in the arrangements of the pretty little objects, my little tastes and fancies, my little methods and inventions which they used to laugh at while they praised them, my odd ways everywhere. I thought, oh, would he be happier for it? Would it not have been better for his peace that I should not have been brought before him? Because although I was not what he thought me, still he loved me very dearly, and it might remind him mournfully of what he believed he had lost." I like this bit. I think it's really powerful. I think there are two reasons why it's really powerful, why I want to draw your attention to it. One is that you see Esther's love for Mr. Woodcourt, and also how strong she knows his love for her is. But it's also really important to note that Mr. Jarndyce knows every single one of Esther's tastes. That Mr. Jarndyce knows what Esther likes so well that Mr. Jarndyce can just like fit up a house just perfectly as Esther would like it, which I think tells you some things about Mr. Jarndyce's like thoughtfulness and Mr. Jarndyce's love for Esther, and Mr. Jarndyce's like how well he knows her. We went out to the porch and he showed me written over it, Bleak House. He led me to a seat among the leaves close by, and sitting down beside me and taking my hand in his, spoke to me thus: "My darling girl, in what there has been between us, I have, I hope, been really solicitous of your happiness. When I wrote to you the letter to which you brought the answer, I had my own too much in view, but I had yours too. Whether under different circumstances I might have ever renewed the old dream I sometimes dream when you were very young, of making you one day my wife, I need not ask myself. I did renew it, and I wrote my letter, and you have brought your answer. When it was that I began to doubt whether what I had done would really make you happy is no matter, Woodcourt came home, and I soon had no doubt at all. Understand me, my dear girl. I had no doubt of your being contented and happy with me being so dutiful and so devoted, but I saw with whom you could be happier. That I had penetrated his secret when Dame Durden was blind to it is no wonder, for I knew all the good that could never change in her, far better than she did. I have long been in Alan Woodcourt's confidence, although he was not until yesterday, a few hours before you came here, in mine. When Alan Woodcourt spoke to you, my dear, he spoke to you with my knowledge and consent, but I gave him no encouragement, not I, for these surprises were my great reward, and I was too wisely to part with a scrap of it. He was to come and tell me all that had passed, and he did. I have no more to say. My dearest, Alan Woodcourt stood beside your father when he lay dead, and stood beside your mother. This is Bleak House. This day I give this house its little mistress, and before God it is the brightest day in my life. He rose and raised me with him. We were no longer alone. My husband, I have called him that name full 7 years now, stood at my side. Alan, said my guardian, take from me a willing gift, the best wife that ever a man had. What more can I say for you, that I know you deserve her? Take with her the little home she brings you. I know what she will make it, Alan. You know what she has made its namesake. Let me share its felicity sometimes, and what do I sacrifice? Nothing, nothing. Esther, my dearest, after so many years there is a kind of parting in this too. I know that my mistake has caused you some distress. Forgive your old guardian in restoring to him to his old place in your affections, and blot it out of your memory. Alan, take my dear. There are quite a lot of things I have to discuss here. One, we need to quickly address the fact that Mr. Jarndyce fought regularly when Esther was a child of one day, making her his wife, which is a bit weird, so I feel like I have to mention it. But passing quickly over that, I have so many conflicting feelings about this scene. I love the fact that Mr. Jarndyce very soon realised that Esther would not be happy with him. He later calls it his mistake. He realises that he should not have asked her to marry him, that it was a mistake, that he was putting his own comfort first, that he was not thinking right, that he wasn't really thinking about her happiness. And we know too, I think, from what he says, that he would never have asked Esther to marry him if it hadn't been for her illness that left her scarred, but he thought perhaps she wouldn't have the same chances of marriage with someone else, and therefore he did ask her to marry her because he loved her. I still do believe he loved her. I know I've had this discussion in the comments with various people about whether or not Mr. Jarndyce is in love with Esther, or whether he just cares about her a lot and is offering her security and a home. I think I still believe that he's in love with her. I think I still believe that. I think that it's really powerful and really moving, that bit where he talks about when he began to doubt whether she would really be happy, and when Mr. Woodcourt came home and he suddenly realised everything. I think it's done really, really well. I also like the fact, minor point here, that Mr. Jarndyce reminds us here that Alan Woodcourt knew both Esther's mother and Esther's father, and kind of was with them just after their deaths, which actually is quite an important and interesting kind of connection between them all. I struggle with the bit where Mr. Jarndyce gives Esther away. Alan, said my guardian, take from me a willing gift, the best wife a man ever had. She isn't given a choice in this, she barely says anything the whole time, and this is just kind of happens. But at the same time, Esther is happy, so I don't know. I have mixed feelings. I also have mixed feelings about the next scene, where Mr. Jarndyce rejects Mr. Guppy on Esther's behalf, because obviously we know that Esther's now going to marry Mr. Woodcourt, and also that she's never loved Mr. Guppy, but also it is significant that Esther says nothing in this scene and that Mr. Jarndyce just does it all for her. I don't think there's too much to say about Mr. Guppy in this scene, because he is a bit silly as always, and very keen to show his prospects in the world more than his affection. But I do think it's important to note that Mr. Guppy does love Esther in his way, and that while the shock of first seeing her scarred from smallpox meant that he kind of retracted all his proposals, he does come back and is no, actually I do love you, I realise. Which does, I think, raise him in my estimation a bit, though he is silly. I think he is a really good character, actually. I think he's really interestingly done, and I think you see here that he is in love with Esther in his way. And, if you see how silly his mother is, poor Mr. Guppy couldn't really escape being silly, could he? And now, on to chapter 65, Beginning the World. What a chapter. Gonna see if I managed to not cry while talking about this chapter. I cried a lot while reading it. In this chapter, the term of the Chancery Courts begin again. Esther goes to the first session with Mr. Woodcourt. On their way, they meet Caddy, and their conversation with Caddy makes them a little bit late. And when they get there, they find that everyone is laughing. All the lawyers are laughing. They're all coming out of the courts. They're all throwing tons of paper up in the air. And what they find out is that Jarndyce and Jarndyce is finished for good. Not because that will solved everything, but because the whole estate has been eaten up by costs. There is literally no money left of the money the original Mr. Jarndyce left, because it's all gone, it's all been eaten up in lawyers' fees and costs over the years. There is no money left, and that is the end. Esther and Mr. Woodcourt manage to find Richard. They see how shocked and distressed he is. He is suddenly taken ill. Richard, in bed, really ill, thoroughly worn out, meets Mr. Jarndyce on good terms for the first time in a long time. He calls Mr. Jarndyce a good man and says that now this is all over, he is going to have to begin the world again. He talks too about how much he loves Ada and how much she has sacrificed for him. He talks about going to live at Bleak House, but he is very, very weak and very ill, and at the very end of the chapter he dies. And I wept a lot, and would you like to see my notes in the margins? It just has 6 sad faces and the word sad. That's all I have to say, really. That's not true. I do have more things to say about the chapter. Let's talk about the scene that greets Esther and Mr. Woodcourt when they come into the law courts. When we came to Westminster Hall, we found that the day's business was begun. Worse than that, we found such an unusual crowd in the Court of Chancery that it was full to the door, and we could neither see nor hear what was passing within. It appeared to be something droll, for occasionally there was a laugh and a cry of silence. It appeared to be something interesting, for everyone was pushing and striving to get nearer. It appeared to be something that made professional gentlemen very merry, for there were several young councillors in wigs and whiskers on the outside of the court, and when one of them told the others about it, they put their hands in their pockets and quite doubled themselves up with laughter and were stamping about the pavement of the hall. We asked the gentleman by us if he knew what calls was on. He told us Jarndyce and Jarndyce. We asked him if he knew what was doing in it. He said, really, he did not. Nobody ever did, but as well as he could make out, it was over. Over for the day, we asked him? No, he said. Over for good. Over for good. When we heard this unaccountable answer, we looked at one another, quite lost in amazement. Could it be possible that the will had set things to right at last, and that Richard and Ada were going to be rich? It seemed too good to be true. Alas, it was. We stood aside, watching for any countenance we knew, and presently great bundles of paper began to be carried out, bundles in bags, bundles too large to be got into any bags. Even these clerks were laughing. We glanced at the papers, and seeing Jarndyce and Jarndyce everywhere, asked an official-looking person who was standing in the midst of them all whether the cause was over, and he said yes, it was all up with it at last, and burst out laughing. What has been done? Repeated Mr. Kenge. Quite so, yes. Why? Not much has been done, not much. We have been checked, brought up suddenly, I would say, upon the, shall I term it, threshold? Is the will considered a genuine document, sir? Said Alan. Will you tell us that? Most certainly, if I could, said Mr. Kenge, but we have not gone into that. We have not gone into that. For many years, I would say the flower of the bar and I would presume to add, the most animated autumnal fruits of the woolsack have been lavished upon Mr. Jarndyce and Jarndyce. If the public have the benefit, and if the country have the adornment of this great gasp, it must be paid for in money or in money's worth. Mr. Kenge, said Alan, appearing enlightened all in a moment. Excuse me, our time presses. Do I understand that the whole estate is found to have been absorbed in costs? Hem. I believe so, said Mr. Kenge. My dearest life, whispered Alan, this will break Richard's heart. So basically, So I hope that this is clear. Basically what's happened is all of the money of the Jarndyce and Jarndyce case, all of the money that was left in that will is now all gone because it has all been absorbed in the costs of running the case over so many decades. It is kind of ridiculous and kind of terrible, and you feel so bad for Richard. Alan had found him sitting on a corner of the court, she told me, like a stone figure. On being roused, he had broken away and made as if he would have spoken in a fierce voice to the judge. He was stopped by his mouth being full of blood, and Alan had brought him home. He was lying on the sofa with his eyes closed when I went in. Opening his eyes by and by, he said in a weak voice but with his old smile, "Dame Durden, kiss me, my dear." And he seems to be calmer and happier than he has been for a long time. Finally, Chancery is settled one way or another. He has no money, he is poor, he is very ill, but there is no longer the same uncertainty. He says that he is very happy in Esther's intended marriage to Mr. Woodcourt, and he seems to look forward, in some way at least, to the future. My guardian saw what passed, came softly by me in a moment, and laid his hand on Richard's. "Oh, sir," said Richard, "you are a good man, you are a good man," and burst into tears for the first time. My guardian, the picture of a good man, sat down in his place, keeping his hands on Richard. "My dear Rick, the clouds have cleared away, and it is all bright now. We can see now. We were all bewildered, Rick, more or less. What matters? And how are you, my dear boy?" "I am very weak, sir, but I hope I shall be stronger. I have to begin the world." "I will not begin it in the old way now. I have learned a lesson now, sir. It was a hard one, but you shall be assured indeed that I have learned it. I say nothing of Ada, but I think of her, and have thought of her very much. Look at her. See her here, sir, bending over the pillow when she has so much need to rest upon it herself. My dear love, my poor girl." And he says again, "I will begin the world." My husband drew a little nearer towards Ada, and I saw him solemnly lift up his hand to warn my guardian. "When shall I go from this place to that pleasant country where the old times are, where I shall have strength to tell what Ada has been to me, where I shall be able to recall my many faults and blindness, where I shall prepare myself to be the guide to my unborn child?" said Richard. "When shall it be?" "Dear Rick, when you are strong enough," returned my guardian. "Ada, my darling." He sought to raise himself a little. Alan raised him so that she could hold him on her bosom, which was what he wanted. "I have done you many wrongs, my own. I have fallen like a poor stray shadow on your way. I have married you to poverty and trouble. I have scattered your means to the wind. Will you forgive me all this, my Ada, before I begin the world?" A smile irradiated his face as she bent to kiss him. He slowly laid his face down upon her bosom, drew his arms closer around her neck, and with one parting sob began the world. Not this world, oh, not this. The world that sets all to right. When all was still, at a late hour, poor Cray's Miss Flights came weeping to me and told me that she had given her birds their liberty. No one writes a better death scene than Dickens. No other writer I've ever read writes a more, moving, powerful death scene than Dickens. I don't know that I have much to say about this, except that it's unbearably sad, and I'm really sad. And Richard's whole plotline, I think, is fantastic. One of the best storylines in Bleak House, but it's also, so awfully, atrociously sad. But I think you do see in this final scene, how much he loves Ada, how strong their connection and love has been, for all that he has been obsessed with other things. And we also see that Chancery, even though it is now over, has destroyed him. We see too, I think, in this chapter, just how much Dickens hates Chancery and hates law courts by the fact that all the lawyers are laughing. They're all laughing about the fact that this case has been absorbed in debt. They're all laughing about this thing which is life and death to Richard, this thing which kills him. The shock of it kills him. It's very sad. I don't know that I have anything else to say. We're getting near the end. Chapter 66, Down in Lincolnshire. In this very short chapter, we revisit Chesney Wold, just so we know what's going on there. Sylvester Dedlock is ill and not doing very well, but he is kind of carrying on with life. And he lives there accompanied and looked after by Mrs. Rouncewell and also Mr. George, and also Phil, who's moved up there with Mr. George, which makes me happy too. So, a few points of interest in this chapter / really beautiful passages that I want to read out. There is a hush upon Chesney Wold in these altered days, as there is upon a portion of the family history. The story goes that Sylvester paid some who could have spoken out to hold their peace, but it is a lame story, feebly whispered and creeping about, and any brighter spark of life it shows soon dies away. It is known for certain that the handsome Lady Dedlock lies in the mausoleum in the park where the trees arch darkly overhead and the owl is heard at night making the woods ring, but whence she was brought home to be laid among the echoes of that solitary place, or how she died, is all a mystery. I know I've talked about this a lot in this series, but I love the fact that Sylvester loves his wife to the end, and that he crushes all of the rumours and that he brings her back and buries her in this grand mausoleum in the park to prove how much he loves her and to prove that she is important and to prove that she deserves her place and her respect and her position within his family. I also like the fact that George is there. There may be seen Sylvester, invalided, bent and almost blind, but of a worthy presence yet, riding with a stalwart man beside him, constant in his bridle rein. The stalwart man, the trooper formerly, is housed. Some relics of his old calling hang upon the walls, and these it is the chosen recreation of a little lame man about the stable yard to keep gleaming bright. He answers to the name of Phil. I love the fact that Phil is there and that Phil goes up to live with Mr. George, partly because I like Phil and partly, as I have spoken before, of my theory that Mr. George and Phil are a bit in love, which makes me happy. I also really enjoy the fact that Sylvester Dedlock and Mr. Boythorn kind of keep their feud going, because Sylvester wants to have a feud because he quite likes to have a feud with someone, and it's Mr. Boythorn's way of comforting Sylvester in his grief is to keep a little bit of a feud going with him. And I like too that Sylvester continues to sit long in the drawing room in front of his wife's picture, thinking of her and loving her still throughout everything. And I think that's all I have to say about that chapter. It is a really short one. And now we come to chapter 67, the close of Esther's narrative. This is another short chapter. In this chapter, Esther kind of closes off her narrative and explains her life now, 7 years on from the events in the book. We hear that Ada had her child shortly after Richard's death, and that Esther is incredibly fond of this child too, and that Esther now has 2 children of her own as well. We learn that Charlie is about to be married, and that Emma, Charlie's sister, is now Esther's maid. We learn that Caddy is doing well, that she works very hard, even more hard because her husband is disabled and cannot work. And we learn how much Esther is beloved by the people around her and by the community, that she is well known as the doctor's wife and liked for her husband's sake, though also, as we kind of know, for her own. And the book ends slightly weirdly with Mr. Woodcourt saying to her that she is as beautiful as she ever was. And basically Esther finishing by saying, well, it doesn't really matter because everyone around her is so good inside and out that they can do very well without any beauty in her. So, things to say about this chapter. Let's talk a little bit about Ada. Ada has a baby boy who they name Richard after his father, and they grew up in close proximity. Esther says later, I call him my Richard, but he says that he has 2 mamas and I am one. So you see that they kind of become a family altogether. And Ada goes to live at the old original Bleak House with Mr. Jarndyce, who becomes kind of her guardian, and Esther lives in her Bleak House with Mr. Woodcourt and her 2 children. I want to talk a little bit about Caddy, because I think her ending is really quite interesting. Caddy keeps her own little carriage now instead of hiring one, and lives full 2 miles further westward than Newham Street. She works very hard, her husband an excellent one, being lame and able to do very little. Still, she is more than contented and does all that she has to do with her heart. I had almost forgotten Caddy's poor little girl. She is not such a mite now, but she is deaf and dumb. I believe there never was a better mother than Caddy, who learns in her scanty intervals of leisure innumerable deaf and dumb arts to soften the afflictions of her child. So I think there's a few things I want to mention here. One is that it's interesting that though Mrs. Jellyby is criticised very heavily, and though Caddy kind of escapes that life in her marriage, Caddy actually ends up doing the bulk of the work in her marriage, and ends up taking on a very active working role in her marriage, just as Mrs. Jellyby did in hers, because Prince is disabled. It doesn't really go into why, but I assume Prince is disabled due to illness, due to the fact that he was very highly overworked in younger life by his father. And I think this storyline of Caddy's and this ending of Caddy's shows both Caddy's ability to triumph over everything and to cope with adversity and to kind of work hard and love those around her, but also shows that all family life, even family life with a better setup than the Jellybys, does have its difficulties too. And I want to talk a little bit about the way Esther talks about Mr. Jarndyce. To Ada and her pretty boy, he is the fondest father. To me, he is what he has ever been, and what name can I give to that? He is my husband's best and dearest friend. He is our children's darling. He is the object of our deepest love and veneration. And I want to talk a little bit about how Esther describes her happiness with Mr. Woodcourt. We are not rich in the bank, but we have always prospered, and we have quite enough. I never walk out with my husband, but I hear the people bless him. The people even praise me as the doctor's wife. The people even like me as I go about, and make so much of me that I'm quite abashed. I owe it all to him, my love, my pride. They like me for his sake, as I do everything I do in life for his sake. I think, again, we have this kind of self-deprecating Esther, but we know as readers, because we've read enough about Esther, that they like her for her sake, because everyone loves her that is around her, because that is the kind of character that she is. What have you been thinking about, my dear? Said Alan then. How curious you are, said I. I am almost ashamed to tell you, but I will. I have been thinking about my old looks, such as they were. And what have you been thinking about them? I've been thinking that I thought it was impossible that you could have loved me any better, even if I had retained them, such as they were, said Alan, laughing. Such as they were, of course. My dear Dame Durden, said Alan, drawing my arm through his, do you ever look in the glass? You know I do. You see me do it. And don't you know that you are prettier than you ever were? I did not know that. I'm not certain that I know it now, but I know that my dearest little pets are very pretty, and that my darling is very beautiful, and that my husband is very handsome, and that my guardian has the brightest and the most benevolent face that ever was seen, and that they can do very well without much beauty in me, even supposing. And then we end with an M dash. The book ends in the middle of a sentence, but I think it's really interesting because I have thought at various points in readings of Bleak House, does this ending suggest that Esther's scarring is fading? I think it doesn't. I think it just suggests one of the points that Dickens is making in this book, which is not a point that his earlier books contain, a similar point to books like Jane Eyre make, and Olive by Dan and Mullet Craik, that goodness is not about physical beauty, because there is this idea in the Victorian period, which I've spoken about a lot in the past, that outer beauty should reflect inner goodness, that if people are beautiful it's obviously because they're good, which is how the Victorians thought about the world sometimes, not always, but it was a common idea. And I think one of the things Dickens does in Bleak House, along with many other things, is kind of tear that apart by the fact that Esther is incredibly good, but she is also physically scarred from the middle of the book, and she is not conventionally beautiful by Victorian standards. And when Mr. Woodcourt at the end says, no, you're prettier than you ever were to me, I think it's because the idea is that she's better and more good than she ever was. She's kinder and more selfless. She's still as good a person as she ever was, if not more, and therefore she is beautiful to Mr. Woodcourt. Anyway, I don't think there's anything else I have to say. I think that is all. This has been a very long read along of Bleak House. Please let me know down in the comments how you've enjoyed Bleak House and how you have enjoyed reading in this serialised fashion. I should say at this point as well that I'm not planning on doing another Victorian-style serialised read-along. I've really enjoyed doing both this one and the one of our mutual friend, in that I've really enjoyed making the videos and really enjoyed discussing the books with people, but I don't actually think that this is the most enjoyable way to read Dickens for me. Even though this is the way the Victorians used to do it, I don't think this is the way I enjoy Dickens best. Like, I still have really enjoyed my rereads of Our Mutual Friend and Bleak House, but I feel like I would have enjoyed them more if I had read them in like a month each rather than 18 months, because I just think it's not the way I love best to read Dickens. And I also think it's meant that I haven't reread as much Dickens as I would have done in the last 3 years if I hadn't been rereading these. And I really just want to like reread some Dickens in a really short space of time, and listen to some Dickens on audiobook as well, because I really love listening to Dickens on audiobook. Like, Dickens works so well on audiobook, but like if I'm making videos in this way where I have to take notes in the book, I can't listen on audiobook to do that, and I really just want to listen to some Dickens on audiobook. I would also like to do some more like short-term read-alongs in general of modern and classic books, but I'd like to do like a read-along of some Gaskell or some Trollope or one of my other 19th century authors, or one of my favourite modern authors. I've really enjoyed doing the Diane Setterfield read-alongs that I've done, both of which have been like less than 2 weeks. So there will be more read-alongs on this channel, but I'm not planning on doing a Victorian-style serialised one for a while, just because this format is very labour intensive, and I don't actually think reading serially is what I want to do that often. I don't think that it, for me, is the most enjoyable way to read a Victorian book. I know it's how the Victorians read originally, and I find that weird, but I don't actually think that it is, for me, the most enjoyable. So I hope that makes sense. I hope that doesn't put like a downer on this video or this series. I have really enjoyed doing this read-along, but I'm not planning on doing another one, just so people know. But yeah, that is all for today. As I said, let me know down in the comments how you've been getting on with Bleak House, and if you liked it or not. I would be very eager to know, and how you found as well reading serially, and how you enjoyed it or didn't enjoy it. I'd be curious to know as well. And that is all for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.